Do you believe you have true friends? People who genuinely care about you, without ulterior motives? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist, made a discovery that could shake everything you think about human relationships. He unveiled a dark truth. Behind every seemingly sincere smile, there exists a psychological reality that is far more complex and disturbing. Jung revealed that we all carry hidden aspects of personality, impulses, desires, and motivations that we don't even recognize in ourselves. He discovered that we constantly wear social masks, which he called personas, and that true human intimacy is almost impossible when we don't even fully know our own shadow aspects. How many times have you been betrayed by someone you trusted blindly? How many times have you discovered that that special person had selfish motivations? It wasn't a coincidence. Jung mapped the psychological mechanisms that make genuine friendship extremely rare. Prepare yourself for a disturbing revelation about human nature that could forever transform how you view your relationships. 1. The persona, the mask we all wear. Picture this. You wake up every morning and before stepping out of your house, you put on an invisible mask. This mask isn't made of plastic or fabric. It's crafted from expectations, social norms, and the desperate need to be accepted. Carl Jung called this psychological disguise the persona, and he discovered something terrifying. Most people never take this mask off, not even when they're alone. Jung derived the term persona from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre. But unlike theatrical masks that actors remove after the show, our psychological personas become so deeply embedded that we forget we're wearing them. We become the mask, and the mask becomes us. This is where the illusion of friendship begins to crumble. Think about your closest relationships right now. How much of what you show these people is authentically you? And how much is a carefully curated version designed to maintain their approval? Jung observed that we construct different personas for different social contexts: the professional mask at work, the loving mask with family, the fun mask with friends. But here's the shocking reality. If you're always wearing a mask, how can anyone truly know you? And if they don't know you, how can they genuinely be your friend? The persona serves a crucial evolutionary function. It helps us navigate complex social hierarchies, avoid conflict, and maintain group cohesion. But Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid or dominant, it creates what he called persona inflation, a state where we become so identified with our social mask that we lose touch with our authentic self. This is when relationships become transactional rather than genuine. Consider the colleague who always appears cheerful and helpful at work. They laugh at every joke, volunteer for extra projects, and seem genuinely interested in everyone's weekend plans. But Jung would ask, what lies beneath this perpetual pleasantness? What aspects of their personality are they suppressing to maintain this agreeable facade? The answer is often uncomfortable: irritation, judgment, envy, or simply the exhaustion of constantly performing. The most unsettling aspect of the persona is how unconscious it becomes. We don't deliberately decide to put on a mask each morning. We slip into these roles automatically. A mother might suppress her frustration to appear nurturing. A leader might hide their uncertainty to project confidence. A friend might mask their competitiveness to seem supportive. These aren't necessarily acts of deception. Often people genuinely believe they are being authentic while unconsciously filtering their expression through their persona. Jung observed that the persona creates a fundamental barrier to intimacy. When two personas interact, no genuine connection occurs. It's merely a dance of social expectations. Real friendship requires what Jung called authentic encounter, where individuals risk showing their unmasked selves. But this rarely happens because removing the persona feels dangerous. Without our protective masks, we fear rejection, judgment, or abandonment. The tragedy of persona-driven relationships is their superficiality masquerading as depth. People can spend decades together, as friends, partners, or family members, without ever truly knowing each other beyond their social masks. They relate to each other's personas rather than their authentic selves, creating the illusion of closeness while maintaining emotional distance. Jung discovered that the persona also serves as a defense mechanism against our own shadow aspects, the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. By constructing a persona that embodies our idealized self, we can disown the qualities that make us uncomfortable. The eternally positive person doesn't have to face their cynicism, the perpetually strong individual can avoid their vulnerability, and the always generous friend can ignore their selfishness. This psychological mechanism has profound implications for friendship. If someone can't acknowledge their own shadow aspects, how can they truly accept these qualities in others? Jung argued that genuine relationships require the integration of both light and shadow aspects of personality. But most people are so invested in maintaining their personas that they unconsciously expect others to do the same. The persona also creates what Jung called mutual deception in relationships. Both parties present idealized versions of themselves while secretly harboring expectations that the other person will maintain their mask as well. When someone's authentic self begins to emerge, perhaps they express anger, vulnerability, or selfishness. It can threaten the entire relationship dynamic because it challenges the unspoken agreement to keep the personas intact. Perhaps most disturbing is how the persona can become addictive. The social validation we receive for our masked behavior reinforces the pattern, making it increasingly difficult to risk authentic expression. We become dependent on the approval we receive for our performance, even though this approval isn't truly for us. It's for our carefully constructed image. Jung warned that living primarily through the persona leads to what he called spiritual emptiness, a sense of disconnection from one's authentic self and others. The constant performance becomes exhausting, yet we can't imagine living without it. This is why many people report feeling lonely even when surrounded by friends. They're surrounded by personas interacting with other personas, creating the semblance of connection without its substance. The implications are profound. If we're all wearing masks and we only know each other's masks, then true friendship becomes nearly impossible. We're not actually friends with people. We're friends with their performances. And they're not friends with us. They're friends with our act. Jung's insight reveals why so many relationships feel hollow, despite appearing successful on the surface. Understanding the persona doesn't mean we should abandon all social courtesy or appropriate behavior. Jung advocated for what he called conscious use of the persona, being aware when we're employing social masks and making deliberate choices about when and how to do so. The goal isn't to eliminate the persona, but to avoid being consumed by it, maintaining connection to our authentic self while navigating social realities. This awareness becomes the first step toward genuine relationship, recognizing that both we and others are far more complex than the masks we present, and that real intimacy requires the courage to occasionally let those masks slip, revealing the messy, complicated, but ultimately more authentic human being underneath. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the S.I.M method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. 2. The shadow. The side we deny having. Every human being carries within them a dark passenger, a hidden collection of traits, impulses and desires that they refuse to acknowledge. Carl Jung called this psychological phenomenon the shadow, and his research revealed a disturbing truth. The very qualities we most vehemently deny in ourselves are often the ones that secretly drive our behavior. More shocking still, these shadow aspects directly sabotage our ability to form genuine friendships because we can't truly connect with others when we're actively running from parts of ourselves. Jung discovered the shadow through years of clinical observation and his own painful self-analysis. He noticed that patients would consistently project their disowned qualities onto others, seeing in friends and enemies the very traits they couldn't bear to recognize in themselves. The person who prides themselves on their honesty might be unconsciously manipulative. The individual who appears endlessly generous could harbor deep resentment about always giving. The friend who seems perpetually positive might be suppressing an ocean of rage. The shadow isn't simply our bad qualities, it's everything about ourselves that doesn't fit our idealized self-image. It includes positive traits we've been taught to suppress, negative emotions we've learned to hide, and natural impulses we've been conditioned to deny. A person raised to be always selfless might shadow their healthy self-interest. Someone taught to be constantly strong might disown their need for comfort and support. What makes the shadow particularly insidious in relationships is how it operates unconsciously. We don't deliberately choose to deny these aspects of ourselves. The repression happens automatically as a protective mechanism. But Jung warned that what we don't own within ourselves, we inevitably project onto others. This creates a fundamental distortion in how we perceive and relate to people. Consider the friend who constantly criticizes others for being fake or attention-seeking. Jung would suggest examining what this person might be denying about their own need for validation or their own performative behaviors. The individual who gets irrationally angry at selfish people might be struggling with their own disowned selfishness. We become most triggered by the qualities in others that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. This projection mechanism destroys authentic friendship because we're not actually seeing other people clearly. We're seeing them through the distorted lens of our own psychological projections. We might be drawn to someone because they express qualities we've shadowed in ourselves, creating an unconscious attraction. Conversely, we might inexplicably dislike someone who mirrors our disowned traits, experiencing them as threatening or repulsive. Jung observed that the shadow often emerges in moments of stress, fatigue, or emotional intensity, times when our conscious control weakens. The perpetually kind person might suddenly snap with unexpected cruelty. The always responsible individual might act with shocking recklessness. The friend who never shows vulnerability might break down with dramatic emotional intensity. These aren't aberrations. They're glimpses of the shadow breaking through our conscious defenses. The shadow also manifests in our dreams, fantasies, and the qualities we secretly admire or despise in others. Jung encouraged people to pay attention to their strongest emotional reactions to other people, as these often point directly to shadow material. The celebrities we obsess over, the people we irrationally hate, the qualities we find most attractive or repulsive, all provide clues about what we've disowned within ourselves. In friendships, the shadow creates what Jung called unconscious contracts. We unconsciously seek out relationships that allow us to maintain our self-image while vicariously experiencing our shadow through others. The good friend might unconsciously encourage their rebellious friends acting out, living through their friend's expression of qualities they've denied in themselves. The rational person might be drawn to highly emotional friends, experiencing feeling through their relationships while maintaining their identity as logical and controlled. These shadow dynamics create unstable and ultimately inauthentic relationships. When we're using friends to express our disowned qualities, we're not truly seeing or accepting them as individuals. we're using them as psychological repositories for parts of ourselves we can't integrate. This creates a form of emotional parasitism disguised as friendship. Jung discovered that the shadow often contains not just negative qualities but also positive traits we've learned to suppress. A person raised in a family that valued modesty might shadow their natural confidence and charisma. Someone taught that intelligence was threatening might disown their mental capabilities. These golden shadow aspects represent untapped potential, but their denial creates an internal sense of emptiness and inadequacy that affects all relationships. The shadow also includes what Jung called primitive aspects of human nature, basic drives for power, sex, aggression, and survival that civilized society teaches us to suppress. But denying these fundamental aspects of human nature doesn't eliminate them. It drives them underground where they influence behavior in unconscious and often destructive ways. The person who denies their aggressive impulses might express them through passive aggression or by unconsciously choosing relationships with aggressive partners. Perhaps most disturbing is how the shadow affects our capacity for genuine intimacy. True closeness requires what Jung called shadow integration, the ability to acknowledge and accept our full complexity as human beings. But most people are so invested in maintaining their idealized self-image that they can't risk the vulnerability required for authentic connection. They present only their acceptable qualities while desperately trying to hide or deny everything else. This creates relationships built on mutual deception and self-deception. We show others only the parts of ourselves we deem worthy of love, while secretly fearing that if they saw our shadow aspects, they would reject us. Meanwhile, we often can't truly accept others because we're unconsciously expecting them to maintain the same level of self-deception we maintain about ourselves. Jung argued that shadow work, the process of recognizing, accepting, and integrating our disowned qualities, is essential for psychological health and authentic relationships. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning moral principles. Instead, it means developing conscious awareness of our full complexity and learning to relate to others from this place of integrated wholeness rather than from the fragmented perspective of denied aspects. The shadow also reveals why many friendships don't survive major life transitions or crises. When external pressures increase, our shadow aspects are more likely to emerge, challenging the carefully maintained images we've presented to friends. The friend who seemed endlessly supportive might reveal their capacity for judgment when we're struggling. The person who appeared strong and stable might become demanding and needy during their own difficulties. These aren't betrayals. They're revelations of the human complexity that was always present, but hidden. Understanding the shadow explains why genuine friendship is so rare and difficult. It requires the courage to face our own disowned qualities and the maturity to accept the full complexity of others. Most people lack either the self-awareness to recognize their shadow or the emotional resilience to maintain relationships with people who occasionally reveal their less idealized aspects. Jung's exploration of the shadow reveals a fundamental challenge in human relationships. How can we truly know and accept others when we don't know and accept ourselves? The shadow represents everything we've decided is unacceptable about being human, but until we reclaim these disowned parts of ourselves, our relationships remain superficial performances rather than authentic encounters between whole human beings. 3. The collective unconscious. Why we act like everyone else. Here's a disturbing realization that Carl Jung uncovered. You think your thoughts are your own, but they're not. Your desires, fears, reactions, and even your deepest beliefs are largely programmed by invisible psychological forces that Jung called the collective unconscious. This discovery shattered the illusion of individual autonomy and revealed why authentic friendship is nearly impossible. We're not really relating to unique individuals, but to walking collections of shared psychological patterns that masquerade as personality. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious emerged from his observation that certain symbols, myths, and behavioral patterns appear across all cultures and throughout history, despite having no direct cultural transmission. He realized that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of shared psychological content that influences every human being. This isn't learned behavior. It's inherited psychological structure, like having brown eyes or being right-handed. The collective unconscious operates through what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that shape how we perceive, feel, and behave. These archetypes include the mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow, and dozens of others. But here's what makes this revelation so unsettling. When these archetypes activate in our psyche, we lose individual agency and begin acting out ancient psychological scripts. Think about your closest friendships. How much of your interaction follows predictable patterns? The friend who always plays the rescuer, the one who constantly needs saving, the person who serves as the group's entertainer, the individual who takes on the role of the wise advisor. These aren't unique personality traits. They're archetypal roles that people unconsciously adopt. And Jung discovered that we often choose friends based on how well they complement our own archetypal patterns rather than appreciating them as unique individuals. The collective unconscious explains why friendship groups often develop similar dynamics regardless of the specific people involved. There's usually someone who becomes the scapegoat, someone who emerges as the leader, someone who plays the mediator, and someone who serves as the rebel. These roles aren't consciously assigned. They emerge automatically as the collective unconscious organizes group behavior according to ancient patterns. Jung observed that the collective unconscious becomes particularly active during times of stress, uncertainty, or transition. When people feel threatened or confused, they regress into archetypal patterns of behavior that feel familiar and safe. This is why crisis situations often reveal the superficiality of many friendships. People abandon their individual responses and fall back into collective patterns that may not align with their personal relationships. Consider how people behave during social movements, political upheavals, or cultural shifts. Jung noticed that individuals who seemed unique and independent suddenly begin thinking, feeling, and acting in remarkably similar ways. Their language becomes identical, their emotional responses mirror each other, and their behaviors follow predictable patterns. They believe they're expressing their authentic selves, but they're actually being possessed by collective psychological forces. This archetypal possession creates what Jung called psychological inflation, a state where people lose touch with their individual identity and become identified with collective patterns. The person who gets caught up in a political movement might lose their capacity for nuanced thinking, seeing the world only through the archetypal lens of good versus evil. The individual who becomes obsessed with a romantic relationship might be possessed by the archetypal pattern of the lover, losing their independent judgment and personal boundaries. In friendships, archetypal possession manifests as people unconsciously casting each other in predetermined roles. The person who always needs advice isn't necessarily seeking wisdom. They're unconsciously activating the archetypal pattern of the eternal child seeking a parental figure. The friend who always gives advice isn't necessarily wise. They're being possessed by the archetypal role of the wise elder or magical helper. These patterns feel natural and satisfying because they tap into deep psychological structures, but they prevent authentic relationship. Jung discovered that the collective unconscious also contains what he called cultural complexes, shared psychological patterns specific to particular groups, nations, or time periods. Americans carry certain collective psychological patterns that differ from those of Europeans or Asians. Each generation develops its own collective complexes that influence behavior in predictable ways. These cultural patterns become so deeply embedded that people mistake them for individual personality traits. The collective unconscious explains why friendship often involves unconscious conformity rather than genuine connection. People are drawn to others who share similar archetypal patterns, or who complement their own psychological roles. But this attraction isn't based on appreciating the other person's unique qualities. It's based on how well they fit into predetermined psychological templates. This creates relationships that feel meaningful, but lack authentic depth. Friends might spend years together without ever truly seeing each other as individuals, because they're relating to each other through the lens of collective patterns. The supportive friend, the fun friend, the reliable friend. These aren't descriptions of unique human beings, but archetypal roles that people unconsciously adopt and maintain. Jung observed that the collective unconscious becomes particularly problematic when it remains completely unconscious. When people don't recognize these universal patterns operating within them, they become puppets of psychological forces beyond their awareness. They believe they're making individual choices, but they're actually following ancient scripts that have been shaping human behavior for millennia. The collective unconscious also explains why peer pressure is so powerful and why people often abandon their values to fit in with groups. The need for belonging taps into archetypal patterns of tribal survival that override individual conscience. People will betray their own principles and even their closest friends to maintain their position within the collective, not because they're weak or immoral, but because they're being overwhelmed by unconscious psychological forces. Perhaps most disturbing is how the collective unconscious influences what we consider attractive or desirable in relationships. Our preferences for certain personality types, physical characteristics, or behavioral patterns are largely determined by archetypal templates rather than individual choice. We think we're choosing friends based on personal compatibility, but we're often selecting people who fit predetermined psychological patterns activated by the collective unconscious. This explains why many friendships follow predictable trajectories regardless of the specific individuals involved. The initial attraction, the honeymoon period, the emergence of conflicts, the eventual disappointment or dissolution. These patterns repeat because they're not based on individual relationships but on archetypal dynamics playing out through human personalities. Jung argued that becoming conscious of the collective unconscious is essential for developing authentic relationships. This doesn't mean rejecting these universal patterns. They're part of human nature and serve important psychological functions. Instead, it means recognizing when we're being influenced by collective forces and making conscious choices about how to respond. The collective unconscious also reveals why genuine individuation, the process of becoming authentically oneself, is so rare and difficult. Most people never develop beyond the collective patterns they inherit from their culture, family, and historical moment. They mistake conformity to these patterns for authenticity, never realizing that their supposedly unique personality is largely a collection of shared psychological templates. Understanding the collective unconscious transforms how we view friendship and relationship. It reveals that most of what we consider personal connection is actually the interplay of impersonal psychological forces. True friendship requires the courage to see beyond these collective patterns and relate to the unique individual who exists beneath the archetypal masks. This awareness explains why authentic relationships feel so rare and precious. They require two people who have developed enough consciousness to recognize and transcend the collective patterns that normally govern human interaction. Only when we can see past the archetypal roles can we begin to encounter each other as genuine individuals, rather than as walking collections of inherited psychological scripts. Jung's revelation about the collective unconscious suggests that most of what we call friendship is actually a form of mutual psychological sleepwalking, people relating to each other through unconscious patterns while believing they're engaged in conscious, individual connection. True awakening in relationship requires recognizing these collective forces and choosing to relate from a place of conscious individuality rather than unconscious conformity. Fourth projection: how we blame others for our own flaws. Carl Jung made one of the most uncomfortable discoveries about human psychology. We don't see people as they actually are. We see them contaminated by our own unresolved psychological material. This mechanism, which Jung called projection, reveals why genuine friendship is nearly impossible. We're constantly throwing our own disowned qualities, unmet needs, and unhealed wounds onto others, then reacting to these projections as if they were reality. Essentially, we're having relationships with distorted versions of people that exist primarily in our own minds. Projection operates like a psychological movie projector, casting the contents of our unconscious onto the screen of other people's personalities. Just as a movie projector displays images that aren't actually part of the screen, we attribute qualities, motivations, and characteristics to others that primarily exist within our own psyche. The most disturbing aspect is that we're usually completely unaware we're doing this. We genuinely believe we're seeing others clearly when we're actually seeing our own psychological reflections. Jung discovered that projection serves a protective function for the ego. Rather than facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves, we unconsciously locate these qualities in other people. The person who struggles with dishonesty becomes hypersensitive to perceived lies in others. The individual wrestling with their own selfishness constantly accuses friends of being self-centered. The person denying their own manipulative tendencies sees manipulation everywhere around them. This psychological mechanism creates what Jung called projected relationships, connections based more on our internal psychological dynamics than on the actual qualities of the other person. We fall into friendships with people who seem to embody what we need to heal or integrate within ourselves, but we remain unconscious of this psychological pull. The attraction feels natural and inevitable, but it's actually driven by unresolved internal tensions seeking external resolution. Consider the friend who constantly irritates you with their neediness. Jung would ask, what might this trigger about your own disowned dependency needs? Perhaps you've learned to suppress your own need for support and attention, so when someone else expresses these qualities openly, it threatens your psychological defenses. Your irritation isn't really about their behavior. It's about your own internal conflict with these natural human needs. Projection becomes particularly complex in close relationships because it often contains both positive and negative elements. We might project our own unlived potential onto friends, seeing them as more talented, attractive, or capable than they actually are. This creates unrealistic expectations and inevitable disappointment when they fail to live up to our projected idealization. Conversely, we might project our own feared inadequacies onto them, constantly finding fault and criticism where none may be warranted. Jung observed that the intensity of our emotional reactions to others often indicates the presence of projection. When someone's behavior triggers disproportionate anger, attraction, disgust, or fascination, we're likely encountering our own projected material. The friend who always has to be right might be carrying our own projected intellectual insecurity. The person we find impossibly perfect might be holding our own disowned positive qualities. The projection mechanism explains why so many friendships follow predictable patterns of idealization followed by disillusionment. During the initial phase, we project our positive needs and unlived potentials onto the other person, creating an inflated sense of their wonderful qualities. They seem to possess exactly what we've been seeking: understanding, excitement, stability, or adventure. But since these projections aren't based on their actual qualities, reality eventually intrudes. When the projection bubble bursts, we often swing to the opposite extreme, now projecting our negative qualities onto the same person. The friend who once seemed perfectly understanding becomes impossibly selfish. The person who appeared excitingly spontaneous now seems irresponsibly chaotic. We haven't discovered new information about them. We've simply shifted from positive to negative projection while remaining equally unconscious of our own psychological process. Jung discovered that projection creates what he called unconscious participation mystique, a psychological fusion where we lose the ability to distinguish between ourselves and others. We become emotionally merged with our friends, feeling responsible for their emotions, taking their problems personally, or expecting them to fulfill our unmet psychological needs. This isn't intimacy. It's psychological enmeshment based on unresolved internal dynamics. The projection mechanism also explains why we often choose friends who seem to complement our conscious personality while actually mirroring our unconscious conflicts. The person who identifies as rational might be drawn to highly emotional friends, not because opposites attract, but because they're unconsciously seeking to connect with their own denied emotional nature through the relationship. They project their disowned feeling function onto their friend, then either idealize them for their emotional capacity or criticize them for being too sensitive. Perhaps most disturbing is how projection prevents us from truly helping or supporting our friends. When we're seeing them through the lens of our own projected material, we can't accurately assess their actual needs or struggles. We might offer advice based on our own internal conflicts rather than their real situation. We might try to fix problems in them that primarily exist within our own psyche. We might become frustrated when they don't respond to our help in the way we expect, not realizing we've been addressing our own issues rather than theirs. Jung observed that projection often intensifies during periods of personal stress or transition. When our own psychological equilibrium is threatened, we unconsciously seek external targets for our internal turmoil. The friend going through a difficult divorce might suddenly see betrayal and dishonesty everywhere. The person struggling with career uncertainty might become hypercritical of others' professional choices. The individual facing their own mortality might become obsessed with others' health and lifestyle decisions. Projection also operates collectively, creating shared projections within friendship groups. The group might unconsciously designate one member to carry certain projected qualities: the rebel, the responsible one, the victim, or the troublemaker. These roles become rigid and limiting, preventing individuals from expressing their full complexity while serving the group's unconscious need to organize and contain threatening psychological material. The mechanism of projection reveals why authentic empathy is so rare. True empathy requires the ability to sense another person's actual emotional experience without contaminating it with our own projected material. But most of what we interpret as empathy is actually sympathy based on projection. We recognize in others the emotions we've experienced ourselves, then assume they're feeling what we would feel in similar circumstances. Jung argued that recognizing and withdrawing projections is essential for psychological development and authentic relationship. This process requires developing what he called active imagination, the ability to hold psychological tension internally rather than unconsciously throwing it onto others. It means taking responsibility for our own emotional reactions and examining what they might reveal about our internal state, rather than immediately assuming they're caused by other people's behavior. The withdrawal of projections is often experienced as loss or disappointment, because we must give up the fantasy relationships we've created in favor of seeing people as they actually are. The friend we've idealized reveals themselves to be ordinarily human. The person we've demonized shows unexpected depth and complexity. This process can feel disorienting because it requires us to take back the psychological energy we've been investing in projected relationships and use it for our own internal development. Perhaps most challenging is recognizing positive projections, the ways we attribute our own unlived potential to others while remaining disconnected from these qualities within ourselves. We might admire a friend's confidence while failing to develop our own. We might be fascinated by someone's creativity while neglecting our own artistic impulses. These positive projections rob us of our own development while creating unrealistic expectations for others. Jung discovered that projection serves as a bridge between the unconscious and conscious mind. What we project onto others often represents aspects of ourselves that are trying to become conscious. The friend who irritates us with their stubbornness might be showing us our own capacity for determination. The person we admire for their independence might be reflecting our own need for autonomy. Projection becomes a diagnostic tool for understanding our own psychological development. Understanding projection transforms how we interpret relationship difficulties. Instead of immediately blaming others for problems or conflicts, we can ask, what might this situation be revealing about my own internal dynamics? This doesn't mean taking responsibility for others' behavior or denying genuine problems, but it does mean recognizing that our perception of others is always filtered through our own psychological lens. The recognition of projection as a universal human mechanism explains why Jung was so pessimistic about the possibility of truly knowing others. If we're constantly seeing people through the distorted lens of our own projected material, how can we ever encounter them as they actually are? This sobering realization reveals why authentic friendship requires not just good intentions, but sustained psychological work to recognize and integrate our own projected material before we can hope to see others clearly. So here's the haunting question Jung leaves us with. If you've spent your entire life seeing others through the lens of your own projections, blaming them for qualities that actually live within you, how many real relationships have you ever actually had? And more unsettling still, if your friends are doing the same thing to you, seeing you not as you are, but as a screen for their own psychological material, then who is truly seeing the real you? Jung's revelation about projection suggests that most of us are walking through life surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone, trapped in a world of psychological mirrors where authentic human connection remains an elusive dream.